Do you believe in God? For most people, belief is a substitute for certainty. We believe in things when we don't know, we believe when we're afraid, we believe when the unknown feels too large to face directly. But Carl Jung rejected belief entirely. When asked if he believed in God, Jung didn't argue, he didn't debate theology, he didn't try to convince anyone. He simply said, "I do not believe I know." That sentence disturbed people, especially scientists, because knowing implies evidence. And Jung was trained to follow evidence wherever it led, even when it contradicted everything psychology was supposed to stand for. What most people don't realize is that Jung didn't arrive at this knowing through faith, philosophy, or mystical experience. He arrived there through observation. For decades, Jung studied people in their final days. He watched what happened to their dreams, their fears, their sense of identity. As death approached, something strange occurred. The personality they had spent their entire lives protecting began to loosen. The ego, the role, the image, the name, the story started to fade, and something else emerged. Again and again, across cultures, religions, and belief systems, Jung observed the same pattern. People who had been terrified of death suddenly became calm, not because someone convinced them of an afterlife, not because religion comforted them, but because their own psyche showed them something. Jung wasn't looking for God. He wasn't trying to prove immortality. He was documenting what appeared naturally when the ego could no longer maintain control. And what appeared was not chaos, not nothingness, but order, wholeness, a sense of continuity. This is why Jung said God was not a belief. It is a psychological fact because beliefs collapse under pressure. What he witnessed did not. When the body weakened, the psyche didn't fragment, it reorganized. And that reorganization followed laws, patterns, symbols that repeated too consistently to dismiss. For Jung, this wasn't spirituality, it was data. And once you see something enough times, across enough people, at the most honest moment of their lives, belief becomes unnecessary. You don't believe in gravity when you fall, you know. And Jung knew he was not witnessing the end of consciousness. He was witnessing its return to something deeper, something that had always been there, long before the body ever arrived. As Jung continued his work with people nearing the end of their lives, he began to notice something that didn't fit any existing psychological model. At first, it appeared subtle. Patients would describe dreams that felt different from their usual ones. Not chaotic, not symbolic in the way dreams normally are, but deliberate, as if something within them knew what was coming before they consciously did. What struck Jung most was not fear, but the absence of it. People who had spent their entire lives anxious, controlling, obsessed with reputation or success, suddenly stopped caring, not in a depressed way, but in a strangely peaceful one. Their dreams changed first. The ego, the part of the psyche responsible for identity, ambition, and self-protection, began to retreat. Dreams about work, conflict, status, and daily worries faded. In their place, new images appeared, journeys, crossings, vast landscapes, circular forms, and these images weren't random, they emerged in a sequence. Jung realized he wasn't observing imagination breaking down, he was watching the psyche reorganize itself. This disturbed him because modern psychology assumed that as the brain deteriorates, the mind fragments, that consciousness weakens as death approaches. But that's not what he saw. Again and again across patients with different backgrounds, different beliefs, and no shared expectations, the same inner process unfolded. As the body failed, the psyche didn't collapse, it simplified, it let go of unnecessary structures, and the first structure to dissolve was always the ego. People stopped dreaming about me. They stopped seeing themselves as the center of the story. Instead, they experienced something larger, something impersonal, vast and strangely familiar. Some described it as a presence, others as a knowing. Others couldn't find words at all, but all of them said the same thing. The dreams felt more real than waking life, not symbolic, not metaphorical, real. Jung noted something even more unsettling. Many of these patients had never been religious. Some were openly skeptical. Some had rejected spirituality their entire lives. Yet the process unfolded anyway, which meant this wasn't belief-shaping experience. It was experience reshaping belief. And the most shocking part? As this inner shift occurred, fear of death disappeared. Not because they were told everything would be okay, but because the psyche itself seemed to be showing them something that made fear irrelevant. Jung began to suspect that what we call death anxiety isn't fear of dying, it's fear of losing the ego. And once the ego loosens its grip, there is nothing left to defend, only something left to remember. What Jung was witnessing wasn't a psychological breakdown, it was preparation, not for annihilation, but for transition. And this realization would lead him to his most disturbing conclusion, one that challenged everything we think we are. As Jung continued documenting the dreams of dying patients, one pattern became impossible to ignore. The dreams didn't change randomly, they followed an order, a sequence, as if the psyche itself knew exactly what it was doing. Over time, Jung realized he wasn't witnessing dozens of individual experiences, he was witnessing one universal process repeating itself. He called it the death preparation process, not because the psyche was anticipating destruction, but because it appeared to be preparing for a transition. The first stage always began the same way. Stage 1, the journey. Patients began dreaming about movement, long roads stretching into the distance, crossing rivers, boarding trains, climbing mountains. These dreams weren't frightening, they felt purposeful. Jung understood journeys symbolically. Across cultures, a journey represents change, movement from one state of being to another. But what struck him was this. The dreamers were never panicked, they weren't lost. They knew where they were going, even if they couldn't explain how. The unconscious wasn't saying, "You are dying," it was saying, "Something is ending and something else is beginning." Then came stage 2. Animals appeared, wise old figures, guides. These weren't personal memories, they were archetypes, universal symbols that exist in every human psyche. The wise old man, the great mother, the shadow. Jung noticed that when these figures began appearing repeatedly, the dreamer felt accompanied, as if they were no longer navigating the transition alone. This wasn't the conscious mind creating comfort. It was the deeper psyche activating something ancient, something that had guided humans through transitions long before language existed. Then the dream shifted again, stage 3. The light. Patients began dreaming of radiant landscapes, golden fields, luminous cities, figures made of light. Many woke up crying, not from sadness, but from awe. They struggled to describe these dreams because they didn't feel symbolic. They felt familiar, more real than waking life. Jung wrote that it was as if the unconscious was showing them their true home, not a place they were going to, but a place they were returning to. And then came stage 4, the most profound stage of all. The dreams stopped being about the individual. No names, no personal stories, no me. Instead, symbols of unity appeared, circles, mandala patterns, spirals. The dreamer no longer stood at the center of the image, they dissolved into it. Jung described this stage as the emergence of the self, Not the ego, not the personality, but the deeper organizing center of the psyche. In these final dreams, the ego didn't die violently. It faded, like a structure no longer needed. What remained was awareness without identity, consciousness without separation. And here is what disturbed Jung most. This process unfolded regardless of belief. It didn't matter whether someone was religious or skeptical, spiritual or materialistic. The sequence remained the same, which meant this wasn't culture, it wasn't suggestion, it wasn't imagination, it was structure, law, pattern. The psyche, when freed from the burden of survival and identity, naturally reorganized itself toward wholeness. Death, Jung realized, wasn't the destroyer of the self, it was the dismantling of what was never essential. And beneath the ego, beneath the mask, beneath the story, something remained. Something that didn't fear the end, because it recognized it, not as extinction, but as return. At first, Jung believed what most people believe, that what he was witnessing was unique to the dying, that the psyche only revealed its deepest layers when the body was failing. But then something happened that shattered that assumption. The same dreams began appearing in people who were not dying, men and women in midlife, patients in analysis, individuals who had never been close to death. They described the same journeys, the same archetypal figures, the same luminous imagery, the same symbols of unity, and there was no medical explanation for it. These people weren't sick, they weren't hallucinating, they weren't influenced by religion or expectation. What they had in common was something else. They had turned inward through deep psychological analysis, through meditation, through what Jung called active imagination, a disciplined dialogue with the unconscious. As they went deeper, the same process unfolded. The ego loosened, old identities began to feel hollow, achievements lost their grip, roles that once felt necessary started to feel false. And beneath all of it, something else emerged. Not chaos, not emptiness, but presence. Jung realized that what he had labeled the death preparation process wasn't actually about dying. It was about awakening. The psyche doesn't wait for the body to fail to reveal the self. It tries to do it your entire life. Through dreams you ignore, through moments of synchronicity you dismiss as coincidence, through quiet dissatisfaction you explain away. Most people never listen. They stay identified with the ego, the constructed self built to survive, perform, and be accepted. And because the ego believes it is the whole person, it fears its own dissolution. But Jung saw something radical. The fear of death doesn't come from the self, it comes from the ego, because the ego knows it is temporary. And anything temporary clings. When people undergoing individuation encountered the self while still alive, something remarkable happened. Death lost its threat. Not because they believed in immortality, but because they had already experienced the part of themselves that does not end. Jung wrote that individuation is not becoming someone new, it is becoming what you already are, beneath the persona, beneath the roles, beneath the story you tell the world. And once that recognition occurs, life doesn't become easier, but it becomes real. You stop defending the mask. You stop chasing validation. You stop living on the surface because you've touched something deeper. And once you know it's there, you can't unsee it. This was Jung's turning point, and it leads to an even more unsettling realization, one that explains why so many people live their entire lives feeling slightly out of place, as if they were meant for something they can't name, and why the psyche keeps calling, even when we refuse to answer. Most people spend their entire lives defending something they've never questioned: their name, their story, their reputation, their role. They call it who I am. But Jung called it something else. He called it the ego. The ego isn't evil. It isn't a flaw. It's a survival structure. It's the psychological system that allows you to function in the world, to work, to relate, to be recognized, to be safe. But Jung discovered something most people never realize. The ego was never meant to be permanent. It was meant to be provisional, a temporary structure built for one phase of life. And the problem begins when you mistake that structure for your essence, when your identity becomes something you have to protect. Think about how much energy goes into maintaining the ego, defending your opinions, curating your image, proving your worth, avoiding anything that threatens how you're seen. The ego is always on guard. Because at some level it knows the truth. It knows it's not whole, it knows it's constructed, and anything constructed can dissolve. This is why the ego fears death. Not because death is annihilation, but because death exposes the illusion. Jung realized that what people call fear of death is actually fear of ego dissolution. The terror isn't I will stop existing. The terror is the version of me I've been defending won't survive. And here's the unsettling part. That version was never who you actually were. It was a mask, necessary, functional, but incomplete. Jung wrote that the ego is like a character in a play who believes the stage is reality. As long as the lights are on, the character feels real, but when the play ends, the role dissolves. What remains isn't nothing, it's the actor. In psychological terms, Jung called that actor the self, the deeper organizing center of the psyche, the part of you that existed before the role and remains after it ends. This is why people who meet the self while they're still alive experience a profound shift. They don't become passive, they don't lose ambition, they don't withdraw from life, they simply stop defending, they stop living from fear. Because when you know you're more than the role loses its grip. You can play it fully without believing it's all you are. Jung didn't ask people to destroy the ego. He asked them to put it in its proper place, as a tool, not an identity. Because the ego was designed to serve life, not to be the center of it. And when you live as if the mask is the self, life feels fragile, threatening, constantly at risk. But when the ego relaxes, something else emerges, something steadier, something that doesn't need defending. And that realization changes how you live long before it changes how you die. Jung believed there was one moment that changes everything, not success, not love, but the moment you stop confusing who you are with what you do. He called the path to that moment individuation. And despite how complex it sounds, individuation is not about becoming someone new. It's about becoming someone real. Most people think growth means adding more knowledge, more confidence, more status, more clarity. Jung discovered the opposite. Individuation is a process of subtraction. You strip away what you're not, the roles you learn to play to be accepted, the identities you adopted to survive, the versions of yourself that were rewarded even when they weren't true. As this process begins, something unsettling happens. The life you built may start to feel unfamiliar. Things that once motivated you lose their power. Achievements feel strangely empty. You begin to feel out of place in a life that looks perfectly fine from the outside. Jung didn't see this as failure, he saw it as a signal. The ego is loosening, and when the ego loosens, space opens. In that space, the self begins to emerge, not as a voice telling you what to do, not as a belief system, but as a sense of alignment. You feel more yourself, even when you can't explain why. Individuation doesn't remove fear from your life, but it changes your relationship to it. Fear stops being something to obey It becomes information. You stop asking, how do I protect who I am? And start asking, what am I avoiding becoming? Jung said that people who meet the self while they are still alive stop living from performance. And they don't chase validation the same way. They're less reactive, less defensive, not because they're detached, but because they're anchored in something deeper than approval. This doesn't make life easier, it makes it honest. You're more aware of your shadow, the parts of yourself you rejected, denied, or hid. But instead of fighting them, you begin to integrate them. Light and dark, strength and weakness, confidence and doubt, not to fix yourself, but to become whole. This is why individuation feels lonely at first. You're no longer living from the collective script, you're listening inward. But that loneliness isn't emptiness, it's space. And in that space, something quiet but unshakable forms. A sense of self that doesn't depend on the role you play, because it existed long before the role was given to you. Jung believed this meeting with the self was the real purpose of life. Not at the end, but now, while you still have time to live from it. Jung believed the self doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't interrupt your life with dramatic revelations. It doesn't demand your attention. It whispers, and most people mistake that whisper for something else, for burnout, for restlessness, for dissatisfaction. But Jung noticed that when the self begins to emerge, the psyche sends signals to prepare you. The first sign is a subtle disconnection from the life you've built. Nothing is technically wrong. Your job is fine, your relationships are stable, your routines work, and yet something feels off. The things that once motivated you don't land the same way. Achievements feel quieter than they used to. This isn't depression, it's the ego losing its monopoly. The second sign appears at night. Your dreams change. They become more vivid, more symbolic, sometimes unsettling. You wake up feeling like you've been somewhere else, somewhere deeper than thought. Jung said, this is the unconscious speaking more clearly because the conscious mind has stopped listening. The third sign is a growing need for solitude. Not because you dislike people, but because noise becomes exhausting. You need space to feel, to reflect, to hear yourself think. Jung wrote that loneliness is the price of individuation, not because you are abandoning others, but because you are temporarily stepping away from the collective voice. The fourth sign is questioning. Beliefs you once held without thought begin to crack. Values inherited from family or culture start to feel borrowed rather than chosen. This can feel destabilizing, but Jung saw it as clarity beginning. The self cannot emerge until the ego is questioned. And the final sign, the one most people feel but can't explain, is a pull, a sense that something is calling you. You don't know what it is, you can't name it. But ignoring it feels like a quiet betrayal. Jung believed this pull is the self reaching out, not demanding change, inviting honesty. You have two choices when these signs appear. You can explain them away, distract yourself, recommit to old goals, double down on the life you know, or you can pause, turn inward, ask not, okay, what's wrong with me? But what is trying to emerge? These signs aren't warnings, they're invitations. Not to abandon your life, but to live it from a deeper place. And once you recognize them for what they are, it becomes much harder to pretend you didn't hear the knock. Jung didn't believe people fail to meet the self because they are incapable. They fail because they are afraid, not of death, not of darkness, but of losing who they think they are. The ego is clever. When the self begins to knock, the ego reframes the call as danger. It says, this isn't practical. Now isn't the right time. You'll lose everything you've built. And for many people, that fear is enough, because the life they've constructed, however hollow it feels, at least makes sense. It has rules, rewards, recognition. The self offers none of that. It offers uncertainty. And Jung understood that uncertainty terrifies the ego more than suffering does. This is why people often turn back just as something real begins. They distract themselves. They chase bigger goals, louder identities, more validation. They call it ambition, but Jung called it avoidance. Another reason people miss the moment is social belonging. Meeting the self often requires stepping away from collective expectations. You begin to see through roles others still take seriously. You stop participating in shared illusions. And that creates distance, not forever, but long enough to feel alone. Most people would rather belong unconsciously than stand alone consciously. Jung said, "This is the great tragedy of modern life. We are taught how to perform, not how to listen inward. So when the ego begins to crack, people assume something is wrong. They medicate the discomfort, pathologize the questioning, rush to restore the old identity. They don't realize the discomfort isn't a problem, it's a threshold. And thresholds are uncomfortable by design, but the deepest reason most people miss the meeting is simpler. They wait too long. They tell themselves there will be time later, after the promotion, after the children grow, after life slows down. Jung saw this pattern again and again in dying patients. At the end, when the ego dissolves anyway, the self finally appears, but by then there's no life left to live from it. This is why Jung's message felt urgent near the end, not because he feared death, but because he saw how many people spent their entire lives defending a self that was never real, and how few allowed themselves to become what they already were. The tragedy isn't that we die, the tragedy is that we wait for permission, wait for certainty, wait until the ego loosens its grip on its own. Jung believed the meeting doesn't have to happen at the end, but it does require courage, not heroic courage, quiet courage, the courage to let something false dissolve before life forces it to. In the final weeks of his life, Carl Jung was not afraid. That alone should make us pause. A man who had spent his entire life studying the human psyche, fear, madness, shadow, death, was calm as his body failed, not hopeful, not distracted, clear. When asked what he believed happens when we die, Jung didn't speculate, he didn't theorize, he said something simple. "I do not think, I know." What Jung was trying to communicate at the end was not a belief about the afterlife, it was a warning about life. He believed the greatest tragedy wasn't death, it was living your entire life as someone you are not, defending a role, protecting an image, mistaking the mask for the face beneath it. Jung saw that the ego, the identity you build to survive the world, will dissolve whether you're ready or not. Time guarantees that. The question is not if it dissolves, the question is when, at the end, or while you still have time to live from what remains. Jung's final message was this: do not wait for death to wake you up. Turn inward now, not to escape life, but to inhabit it more fully. Face the parts of yourself you've avoided, not to fix them, but to integrate them. Stop running from your shadow. It isn't your enemy, it's the doorway. When you stop defending the ego, something else steps forward, something quieter, steadier, unshakable. Jung believed that when you meet the self while you're still alive, life doesn't become easier, but it becomes real. You stop chasing meaning because you're living from it. In the end, Jung wasn't preparing for death. He was letting go of what was never essential. So the self could return, not to somewhere new, but to where it had always been. And his final question left for anyone still alive is not about what happens after death. It's this: Will you wait until the end to discover who you are, or will you meet yourself now, while there is still time to live as what you already are? If this message reached you at this exact moment, Jung would say it isn't random. Carl Jung believed in synchronicity, meaningful coincidence, moments when something outside you aligns perfectly with something inside you. And if you're still here, listening, it means something in you is ready. Not to change everything overnight. Not to abandon your life, but to stop running. To stop pretending the mask is all you are. To stop silencing the quiet pull you felt but couldn't explain. Jung believed the self doesn't force itself on you. It waits, patient, steady, unmoved by time. And when you're ready, it speaks, not in words, but in recognition. A feeling of this is true, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it costs you certainty. You don't have to understand everything now. You only have to take the first step inward. So here's the invitation. If something in you stirred while watching this, leave one word in the comments. Not for me. For yourself, awake, ready, remembering, beginning, whatever feels honest. Because that word marks the moment you stop living on the surface and began walking towards yourself. The journey Jung pointed to doesn't lead away from life. It leads deeper into it. And it starts now.